We're in the book now. It's called Indian Slaves from Caribana, Trade and Labor in the 17th Century, Caribbean. So the 1600s, right? 1600s. Carolyn Mary Arena is the author, right? Submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, Columbia University, 2017. And it says here, abstract, or I guess like the introduction. It says here, indigenous resistance made Caribbean colonization a slow and violent process in the period of 1580 to 1690. Right? Again, 1580, 1690. The Caribbean Indians who rejected colonization became targets for enslavement. Slavers captured indigenous people in raids or through trade within indigenous dominated territories. I conceptualize this space as Caribana. Geographically, it stretched from Guyana northward throughout islands of the Lesser Antilles. I focus on the indigenous captives from Caribana who were enslaved in English and Dutch colonies, namely Barbados, Curaçao, and Suriname. I show how colonists justified enslaving indigenous people in the same manner as they justified the transatlantic African slave trade. All right, so she's telling you, just like the so-called transatlantic slave trade, it was happening here way before that. Just like it, despite widespread taboos against the former practice and not the latter. You see? So, because they always acknowledge the latter, right, which is called the transatlantic, but we already know that's in reverse, but they ignore what's happened before the so-called transatlantic slave trade happened. These taboos did not prevent Indian slavery, but they influenced the creation of 17th century histories, government reports, and other material for public and European consumption. Indian slavery has thus been written about, then and now, as limited phenomenon wherein Indians had limited and specific labor roles, example as fishermen or domestic servants, indentured servants, encomenda. However, sources such as deeds and tax rolls show that more Indian slaves than assumed contributed a broad range of skills to plantations economies. So more Indian slaves assumed, meaning more than what they have told us, actually contributed to a broad range of skills to plantation economies. English Barbados was exceptionally successful because it was geographically separate from the conflicts that created captives in Caribana, but nevertheless extracted Indian slaves from the region. Meanwhile, colonies abutting Caribana, such as Suriname, faced trade sanctions from neighboring Indians and rebellions if they abused the Indian slave trade. Indian slave trade. From 1670s to 1690s, colonial governments limited the means of accessing Indian slaves, but once enslaved, they faced the same restrictive black codes. You hear this? Black codes that allowed the brutal treatment of them as inheritable chattel. All right, we're just talking about American Indians, not Africans. Indian slaves from Caribana, trade and labor in the 17th century, Caribbean. All right, so now we're really in the introduction, I guess. So it says here, in 1668, a member of Charles II's Trade Council, and read up on that, the Trade Council, Benjamin Worsley, considered strategies for supplying plantation laborers for the English sugar colonies, particularly the new acquisition of Jamaica. So they had taken this from Spain. It says Worsley wrote that if the English Caribbean wanted to be sole masters of sugar for all the world, they could potentially use Guyana, the region of the north coast of South America between the Orinoco and Amazon rivers, as a source for Indian slaves. Again, so these English were setting up shop, right? They had just acquired Jamaica. They're going to set up a sugar plantation, and they're already planning to get their slaves, not from Africa, right? But from the region on the north coast of South America between the Orinoco and Amazon rivers. This is in Guyana. As a source for Indian slaves, not Africans. He argued that it would take less time and thus be more profitable. Less time, right, than bringing people all the way from Africa, and thus be more profitable to transport slaves within the Caribbean region rather than from Africa. More profitable, less time to transport slaves within the Caribbean region rather than from Africa. Nevertheless, as this dissertation will highlight, each of these sources contained references to how Indian slaves contributed to the transformation of the Caribbean economy. So who had a strong influence in the transformation of the Caribbean economy? It was Indian slaves, and these sources contain many references of that. Just letting you know. Ad hoc purchases through captive markets and raids on indigenous communities during periods of war threatened Caribbean natives throughout the 17th century. Then we're in the book Indian Slaves from Caribana, Trade and Labor in the 17th Century, Caribbean. And it says here, a number of accounts, deeds, and laws testify to the presence of Indian slaves on Barbados from its first settlement in 1627. Again, a number of accounts, deeds, and laws testify to the presence of Indian slaves on Barbados from its first settlement in 1627, right from the beginning. These were Indians. It was always Indians and always was Indians. Deeds used the language Negroes, Indians, and other slaves. All right? So these deeds, they used the same language, right? As in the States, in the North, when they were classifying all your ancestors together and started making tags and these census records. And so these deeds and these islands as well, had language like Negroes, Indians, and other slaves to describe the laboring population attached to the properties sold. The Barbados Laws and Acts printed for Richard Hall in London in 1764 indicates that for all laws passed regarding Indians, one should see slaves. Again, in 1764, the Barbados Laws and Acts indicates that for all laws passed regarding Indians, one should see slaves. All right, so they made it synonymous. Indian slaves from Caribana, trade and labor in the 17th century Caribbean. And it says here, the rebellion of Metacomb, King Philip's War, 1676-1678, against New England had united multiple indigenous nations. News of this united rebellion created paranoia among the Barbados Assembly, representing the interests of a large plantation owners, about importing Native Americans as slaves to Barbados, as they might incite similar revolts against the colonists. The Barbados legislators did not aim to prevent the import of all Indian slaves, however, but only the Indians from New England, New York, and Rhode Island, who were known to be notorious vigilantes and obstinate, incorrigible rogues and cunning thieves. It would not be until 1688 that the Barbados Assembly decided to outlaw the importation of all Indian slaves to Barbados, which suggests that routes and means of acquiring Indian slaves, apart from connections to North America, had been operating without major opposition for a long time prior to this legislation. All right, did you hear that? Indian slavery was being practiced and operating way before 1688, all right, without major opposition for a long time. Indian slaves from New England and New Netherland, or New York, right, had indeed been a part of the English and Dutch Caribbean landscape since the early 17th century, the early 1600s, meaning even the late 1590s, right? Because going into 1600, right? In Bermuda, English, Providence Island, and we got Providence Island, that's off the coast of Nicaragua and Honduras. They were sending Pequots over there, calling them cannibal Negroes. all right, enslaving the Pequots and sending them to Providence Island, another pilgrim colony, the one they don't teach you about, and Curaçao, Dutch. However, it is unclear how many Indian slaves from North America were in Barbados itself at the time of the 1676 and 1688 acts. In most instances, historians have used sources from New England saying that these captives were sent to the West Indies. All right, West Indies. Historians have guessed that they went to Barbados, since it was the largest recipient of slaves in the English Atlantic for most of the 17th century. For this dissertation, the records reviewed of Indian slaves in Barbados and Suriname do not provide irrefutable evidence of this matter either, since they conflate the origins of all native peoples of the Americas into one category, Indian. Or they know that there are other slaves within it, the list of Negroes. All right, so as you can see, none of these deeds or records says Africans. I hope you've noticed that. All right, so it's Indian, Negroes, and other slaves. They never say Africans, really, in those times, without indicating who or how many of these others were. Right, so they're basically letting you know you can't really know what tribes were there, what native, American natives were being enslaved from where, what specific places of Americas, because they were just listing them as Indians or Negroes or other slaves. And she's telling you right now, this lady who wrote this paper, these things, they're not indicating who or how many of these others were. They're not really indicating, specifics. Consequently, calculating the exact demographics of Indian slaves on the island, as Jerome S. Handler has noted, is an impossibility. Despite the challenge, identifying the origins of the Indian slaves of Barbados reveals how indigenous people throughout the Caribbean influenced colonization, both on Barbados and through Barbados' influence throughout the Americas. The evidence presented in this dissertation shows that we must start our investigation of Indian slavery more locally, as Worsley suggested, within the Caribbean itself. All right, she's letting you know, if you really want to see foundational truth, you have to really search more locally, not from over there in Africa, but locally, as Worsley suggested, within the Caribbean itself. They were enslaving American Indians. My dissertation reveals the context for Indian rebellions, both feared and real, through a narrative of colonial indigenous trade and enslavement in the Caribbean since the 1580s, leading up to the period of the 1670s and 1680s, when colonial legislatures began limiting the trade in Indian slaves. This legislation appeared in Barbados and colonies founded by Barbadians. In Carolina, Alan Galley describes the 1680s as a period when the legislature there began to publish and distribute regulations against keeping Indian slaves. They also proposed penalties against colonists interfering with Indian embassies, and instructed the government and council to establish a commission to meet at least every 2 months in Charlestown to hear all complaints. These laws eventually failed, however, as the colonial legislature did not have the resources to enforce them, nor necessarily the will of the people. Galley suggests that the Indian captives exported from Carolina from the late 17th century through the 18th century most likely ended up in Barbados. Again, they'll tell us in history books, and when we go read about sugar plantations and all that in Barbados, Jamaica, all that, they'll always keep telling us that they kept getting slaves from West Africa. But when we do the research, through this, through the history, follow the trail, you'll see that in these sources, in these original sources, nobody's talking about Africans, and you'll see that it's actually more American Indians being taken to these places for hundreds of years, at the thousands. All right. Because of the strong trade connections between the two colonies and Barbados' insatiable demand for slaves during this period, however, Galley acknowledges that import records for Barbados do not exist to verify this. My research corroborates that Barbados did indeed have precedents of receiving Indian slaves, but I have only found evidence that they were from the circum-Caribbean region prior to the 1670s. And Caribbean Indians probably continued to be the majority of Indian slaves in Barbados because of the aforementioned legislation preventing North American imports in 1676 and 1687. This dissertation shows that Barbados may not have imported North American Indian slaves before this period. It did export the tradition of subsuming indigenous people within the category of Negroes, Indians, and other slaves into the black coats to North American colonies, making Indians, particularly Carib Indians, subject to an imposed racial identity. They were calling these Carib Indians what? Negroes, Indians, or other slaves. Negroes, black coats.